Right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peter Fitness podcast. Today on the show, I have the Hypertrophy Academy team, which is Alan Shoy. I have no idea if I'm saying that right, your last
That was
name. Did I butcher
perfect.
that? Hell yeah. And then Deklan McMichael. That one's a lot easier. But these guys are both more hypertrophy nerds as far as science-based application of it. And I think that right now, science-based training is it's trending for good and bad reasons. There's lots of strong opinions both ways about the personal anecdote side of things, and then the actual, trenches application of what the actually like big guys are doing. And I think that it's really important to sort of know how to apply both things in training, to each individual because like we are so different, and there are limitations of science, but it does give us a really good starting spot, and it can explain a lot of things. In particular about like why you might be observing something as a coach. And I think that's really important for coaches to understand physiology at a fundamental level, and especially with this sort of stuff, so that in the case an athlete is reporting problems in their training, you know how to troubleshoot it. That's sort of how I view it. But why do you guys think that, you know, the science-based training does matter and actually understanding of the science?
I mean, I'll take this. I'll start off. I think that we've come a long way, right? In terms of what we understand, and especially in the last, even 5 or 10 years, there's been massive changes in what we understand about exercise science, right? And so, like, even since I went through uni, there's been some really cool stuff come out, and I think that like it's not so much that everyone has to be up to date with the newest study. It just so happens that in the last like 5 or 10 years, those new studies have actually been pretty important and they've been pretty informative. It wasn't just like, the same changes over the course of the last 50 years. It's been like rapid, in my opinion, in the last 10, 15. And so I think that, it doesn't matter if you miss the next study that comes out next week, as long as you're like, sort of generally up to date with what we understand and what sort of trending, as you put it, I think is a pretty good way of putting it. As long as we sort of have some understanding of that, I think we're good. I think there are some people that definitely go too far, and that was something that we spoke about recently, Alan and I, where it's like we want to understand it really well, and I think we have a decent understanding of it. It's when we start getting distracted by it that it becomes a problem. And I think that's part of why it is trending right now, is because there are people getting distracted and sort of missing out on the bigger picture stuff.
Yeah, I think that was a good perspective. My kind of approach to this is, firstly, I think a coach should understand that understanding the nuance and the science is not going to propel an athlete's progress by years or by any significant margin of time. But I mean, part of it is if when things are going well, it doesn't really matter. But once things start to go wrong, I think you need to have a place to look. And without having an understanding of the science, then you're kind of almost grasping for straws. So yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd agree with that because I think that we need to understand too that genetics plays such a big role in this whole muscle growth thing, strength gain thing. It really just determines your overall ceiling. I think that though for people especially who don't have very good genetics, it's like it matters even more for them to understand how do I get past this plateau. And I think that regardless, if you get to this stage where you are more advanced, like this does become something you do need to be a little bit more aware of. And that's fine if you don't want to, be advanced. Like being advanced sucks. If you want to be like, I'm just going to maintain all my gains up until that point and not go for the last, 5% like that, that's totally fine. But I think that if you do care about this and you care about long-term progression as you keep advancing, then it does come into play. With that being said, for most of my beginners and even my intermediates, like I just tell them like, hey, like, look, don't worry about fatigue, don't worry about like any of this stuff that's trending. Just work hard. Like, follow what I give you on the paper. You're going to be fine. Just learn how to train hard because I think that is the fundamental and like the necessity for building muscle. Things like for example, like I didn't know anything about RPE or any of this stuff when I was starting out. I just trained really hard. I came from an athletic like background. That's what you do, and I got really really far. And then only once I started to slow down did I start realizing, okay, now I need to like start picking my spots where I push hard.
I
Yeah,
mean,
I
I think
think
you
go
go,
ahead.
Alan.
So I think that the what you said is good in terms of like the manner in which you frame it to your clients is very important. And I think a lot of these people that are like on TikTok and younger coaches are really framing the science-based lifting as being the top priority. Whereas when I first sit down with someone from a coaching perspective, my first priority is let's build a program that you can do 20 years from now when you have a family and kids and real responsibilities, not just school. And I think when you put that as the top priority for your athletes and emphasize that over time, they begin to realize like, hey, me like going to the gym and pushing myself is far more important than, whether my program accounts for fatigue, which is still a big factor, but it's not the biggest factor.
Mm. I think that like the difference between sort of maybe our approach and some things that we might see that are trending now is Alan and I think I speak for Alan as well. We sort of got into the gym. We didn't do this stuff when we started. We didn't I don't know what the hell RIR was. I started, just training and just maxing out whenever I wanted. Then it was powerlifting and then we sort of arrived here. And so I've seen both sides, and like obviously my rate of progress would have certainly slowed down quite a lot if I had a stayed training that way, where it was just like, whatever goes. But because we transitioned, when I was maybe fresh out of the beginner stage and gain started to slow down, coincidentally happened to be the same time that I transitioned into like what I'd call a maybe a smarter way of training. And that really kept the progression going. And so like we've seen the other side, and I've also seen now how good progress can be, when you do have that sort of slight understanding of how things work, as Alan said, when things start to get tricky, okay, how can we use our understanding of science now to work around a shoulder dislocation, or the fact that we only have 45 minutes to train 3 times a week, or things like that, where it does actually become quite important. But if you've got, like Alan said, if you've got someone who can train 4 or 5 days a week, as long as they can do it for consistently with high intensity for a really long period of time, that's what we're looking for. And then we just have a bit of fun with everything beyond that point, and we can go back and forth, with specific nuances or scientific stuff to make it just slightly better.
I
Agreed.
really liked Alan's comment on long term and thinking like what can we do for a long period of time, because like the reality about with all this stuff is that the number one denominator is just time and consistency. Like there's nothing that you're going to do that's going to dramatically make you add like 5 pounds of muscle or 50 pounds to your squat like in like a month if you are intermediate or you're advanced. And what matters the most is creating a training approach that is going to be sustainable for the long run, psychologically, physically. And something that is going to be able to adapt to with your lifestyle changing. And I think like, I used to have this perspective that there is the program that I respond to or that my clients respond to, and that this is how it's always going to be. But the past 18 months for me have been very interesting because I was doing exactly what got me to like my 500 dots and getting really strong, and it literally has it stopped working. I literally was like basically an overtraining syndrome without really knowing it for like a very long period of time. Going to just literal 10% reduction in strength or more, chronic aches and pains, injuries, etc. And I think it's important to know how to like peel that back and say, okay, like what am I doing too much of? What can be more efficient there? And like where do I like how much of this is actually junk volume? And I had a really interesting experience when I was dieting down pretty aggressively, where kind of obviously dieting does, you can't recover from as much, but I did kind of realize how much of the extra stuff I was doing because I really had to strip things back to the bare minimum. And Alberto Nunez talked about that on the 3D Muscle Journey podcast about how like that can kind of make you really understand like how little you actually need, not only to maintain muscle, but then if you think about it, like how much more do we need of volume to really, go from maintenance to a good progression? Like I don't think it's that much. And my perspective on volume is that I think that, and this is a question I had for you guys too, is I feel like a lot of it, I don't think it really matters if you choose a high intensity approach or like a low intensity, higher volume approach. I think it matters on a few things. I think that number one, how strong are you? I think if you're strong and you have that like really big psychological arousal, like you guys are both powerlifters. Like I find people who are more self-selected for this, who like pushing themselves harder, generally going to burn out on higher volume programs because like I don't have an off switch, for example. Like I'm going to go to RPE 8 minimum on all my accessories. That's how I like to train. Whereas somebody else might not have that psychological profile and they might just like doing more volume, more pumpy stuff, and that works for them. That's my perspective. But do you guys think that it necessarily matters like that much outside of like preference?
I mean, I look at it as in like the path of least resistance, right? Like if we're going to go from point A to point B, to me it makes sense to get there as like fast and as safe as possible, right? That's that's how I like to train. There are certainly things that maybe I'm not willing to do because, like you just said, there is preference, right? Where maybe if I thought there were tiny changes we could make to our program. Alan does my programming, right? And I think that we would agree. I think we're in a really good spot, but maybe there's like very specific little things we could do to make it better. I don't think it would even be worth it for me because I just wouldn't enjoy it as much. And so when you are, working with a whole variety of people, you will see people who don't have the capacity to train as hard. And so you might trick them into doing a little bit more work by giving them an extra set here and there. That is not the way I'd want to do it. Obviously, we try to coach them up to a point where we can trust how hard they're training, whether or not they're sending us videos. I trust that they're training hard, right? You want to get them there, but if you have to at first, they're a beginner, maybe even women can handle slightly more. Maybe they just can't train hard because of an injury or preference or whatever. Yeah, you can give them more volume, but I think from an efficiency standpoint, I mean, the higher intensity, lower, it doesn't have to be low, but less than what you're sort of suggesting here with, adding heaps to make up for not training as hard. It does make sense to be more efficient. Um, but what do you think, Alan?
No, I think that was a great explanation. So I think to answer this question comprehensively, you have to look at it from two perspectives. One is like, what does the actual data say? And I think, longitudinally, anywhere from 5 to 30 reps has been shown in the long term to have similar outcomes. But the data is inherently like lacking. It's not always telling you the complete picture. And so I think you have to look at the mechanism. And I think mechanistically, we know that higher reps is going to be more fatiguing. You're going to have more of the central and peripheral mechanisms occurring with higher reps. Um, and again, I think it just kind of comes down to like what Declan said. One, the efficiency, but two, troubleshooting, right? If your entire program is higher reps and higher volume and you're starting to feel beat up, I think having that understanding that, okay, mechanistically, maybe this is a little bit less effective can lead you to making changes that are probably going to be beneficial long term.
So basically, what I'm getting for both of you guys is that it seems like the higher intensity and really learning how to actually train and execute a program at a high level and understand where your proximity to failure actually is and what RP10 does feel like, and more so learning how to train closer proximity to failure is basically the foundation of something that you need to teach an athlete in order for them to have most long-term success without spinning their wheels or becoming getting excessively fatigued or running into junk volume.
Hmm.
Yeah, and
I think an important nuance there, sorry, Alan, I think an important nuance is that if we are working with powerlifters, they do have the tendency to undershoot. So going with
Yes.
the slightly easier, higher volume approach is already inherently flawed because they're already undershooting. So then by riding a slightly lower intensity program, your RP8's very quickly RP5. And it's just like we're not really getting many effective reps here whatsoever in an accessory movement. Um, but also, powerlifters go into their sessions with fatigue. I don't know any
Yeah.
powerlifters that don't do SBD first in their sessions. And if they do, it's, like maybe a secondary bench day, they do something else first. But they're all doing SBD first. So you go in with some level of, maybe some peripheral fatigue, but certainly a decent amount of central nervous system fatigue baseline. So you don't have the wiggle room that say maybe Alan and I maybe can do certain things that a powerlifter couldn't get away with because we're fresh when we walk into the gym. A powerlifter's got to go do 3 or 4 sets of squats, which, for most of the block is going to be very taxing. And so for bodybuilders, I actually think we have more wiggle room. When you look at this through a powerlifting lens, there is much less margin for error because
Yep.
we're already playing with so much fatigue. And so that's why when I'm talking bodybuilding, I'm a little bit more relaxed with maybe the physiology because I think it doesn't matter as much as say TikTok is making it out to seem like it does. But for a powerlifter, that's where I sort of put my foot down. I'm like, actually, this does actually matter a lot for powerlifters because you're already at a disadvantage from doing SBD first, which is obviously the sport, but we've got to consider that the fatigue that creates.
yeah, I agree. I think that also like an important point to make is that you can't just balance out lower intensity with higher volume because inherently if you want to see hypertrophy in like the higher threshold fibers and motor units, which if you want to max your hypertrophy is going to be key, you have to train within reasonable proximity to failure, like RIR 2 or below, RIR 1 to 2, I'd say. And so I don't think it's equivalent to say, okay, just because I'm doing lower intensity, I can balance that out by doing higher volume because it's not comparable completely.
I think that's a great point with the Brian was saying Henneman's size for principle. We do need to have those high threshold motor units. I think especially for powerlifting too, like those are what are going to contribute to strength too. And then on hypertrophy movements, like we want to have as specific of adaptations on our accessory movements as we possibly can. And so doing generally like they're not really going that much above 10 reps might make a lot of sense. I think that definitely what you said about like there's less margin for error, especially as you get more advanced. Like, especially as you get more advanced as a powerlifter, you're just that much stronger. And it's really interesting as you look at a lot of these powerlifting, programs. You see a lot of people, powerlifters, you just have like these extremely high volume programs. And I'm just looking at them, I'm like, dude, I would explode. So I've tried them and I'm just like, I can't handle this. Like I just feel so bad and so terribly. And I'll say I don't really care. One of the things that one of my clients has is RPE Marcellus. Like I can look at like volume in a program and tell like how hard someone's pushing generally. And like, I feel fine. I'm like, you're not training as hard as you think that you are. Particularly with the powerlifting, because like if you're actually strong, it's just like the average like hypertrophy volume I've seen with like hard sets and someone's like actually pushing hard is in the range of 4 to 8 sets in addition to the SPD volume that you need to, make progress in that area.
I think, honestly, I mean, if we go back to the mechanisms, which is what Alan brought up before, we know that 2 sets once a week will cause muscle growth, right? Sorry, 1 set twice a week. My bad. So if you do, a set of something Tuesday, another set of it Friday, if it's hard enough and done properly, that can stimulate muscle growth, right? So if we have that understanding that 1 set done twice a week is enough, the framing that you just used there, I think it was 4 to 8. I think that's a pretty good generalization, right? I think 10 is a hard cap upper limit for powerlifters, in my opinion. Certainly none of the powerlifters that I work with could go above that, without it really tanking their performance on SBD. And I think there's just no reason to. Like, I don't actually truly, I've never come across a lifter in however many years now that has actually needed more than that to progress fast. And I know that you can do it and progress. I'm not saying you can't, you certainly could. But I mean, me personally, I don't like the intensity that I would have to use to do 10 sets or something a week, 10 sets plus. 12 sets of, say, pecs or lats or whatever a week, you just can't train as hard. You
Yeah.
just can't. It's not possible, and I wouldn't enjoy that. So even if I did think it was better, which I could pretty much definitely say it's not, it's just not enjoyable for me. And I don't think Alan would want to, sacrifice any intensity out of his training either to push the envelope that high just for the sake of it.
Yeah, totally. And I think to play devil's advocate, I think a lot of these like coaches, especially the more popular ones, understand that their clients likely aren't pushing a majority of their hypertrophy work close to failure, and so they compensate by increasing the volume. But as we just mentioned, I don't think you can't effectively substitute lower intensity with higher volume. And so I've had conversations with clients where they make that recommendation. Can we just up the volume since I struggle with the intensity component of things? And I think that's where you need to sit down, actually look at their accessories and their videos, which is your role as a coach, and say, hey, if you really want to maximize your hypertrophy long term, we should be focusing on the intensity component of stuff. And that doesn't mean pushing everything to failure. And that's where I think people kind of lose sight of the bigger picture, but I think it means being reasonably close to it.
Yeah, I think that as far as like proximity to failure, I generally, I'd recommend pacing throughout a block, starting off a little bit lighter, a little bit further from failure. So RP7, which is how I've described to my clients. It's like if you're like really psychologically locked in, like you should be, that's like you feel the weight push back on you, and then you get another rep. Like as it gets really hard, it's burning, and you go another rep, and that's like the first slow down rep in general. Whereas like on accessory movements, I'm a little bit less like I don't like it. Just don't think about it. Just go until you can't move your arms. Like that's how hard I want you to go. And usually that is helpful. And Alan, I love what you said about asking for videos because I generally do trust my athletes, and I'm not trying to like try to babysit them with like accessory movements. I'm like, hey, at bare minimum, I need to know your SBD, so I can hold you accountable, so you got to see bar speed and the E1 RM progression across a block, and hopefully you're pacing that right. But if someone is gaining weight, they're on anabolic steroids and they're gaining weight, and I'm seeing zero like change in muscularity with like the weight gain, I'm going to ask for videos on their accessories and see how hard that they are pushing. And more often than not, I think that is the number one reason why people do not look like they lift is they do not try hard enough when they are actually pushing, they are not actually pushing close enough to failure. Because it's really interesting. Is like you in powerlifting, you can kind of get away with it because of it's so much driven by neurology. And Alan, you got a great post a long time ago. That's permanently burned into my memory about how hypertrophy blocks are dumb because the amount of hypertrophy like time you need to like spend to actually get meaningful hypertrophy and like an advanced lifter is like an entire year. Like, and you
Right.
can't spend that much time away from SBD. But like if you actually want to look jacked and maximize your competitiveness as a powerlifter, like you need to learn how to push hard. And I think especially like I think there does come a point, we'll figure out this point about, you do need a, higher intensity model. I think there becomes a point where, you get to be that late stage, intermediate, advanced, where you have to do that. Like that is the only way that you can like make progress. And maybe if you have really good genetics, you can get that far, but like it's an inefficient route.
Yeah, I think that going back as far as the ramping the accessories, I think that's a good way to do it. We Alan and I, coach pretty similarly, I think, and we both tend to use a progression model that looks like a slightly easier week one. So it's not too different from what you'd see like in a linear powerlifting program where it just gets heavier as the week goes on, but instead of going like RP7, RP8, RP9, RP10, which I think is a very common thing in like 4 week powerlifting blocks. Depending on the lifter, the proximity to competition, the exercise, all those nuances, like we tend to just sort of start it a little higher and then just baseline it a little bit more because from what we understand about, the Henneman size principle and what you mentioned before about intensity, you probably don't necessarily need to go to failure on everything, right? And as a powerlifter, we do have to consider the fatigue and of course the motivation, the mental aspect, the toll they can have on arousal, etc. And so maybe starting a little higher and say maybe we start at RP8 depending on the movement. Your single joint sort of non-competition muscles, lateral delts, biceps, things like that. You could almost definitely start at RP9 and just go RP9 all year, maybe RP10 sometimes. But I think that a very common thing is to have the intensity on accessories ramp up very quickly and then go into the next block and it drops down again. And so I think that some people will maybe not spend enough time at a higher intensity to really learn something like a leg press. That takes months. Once you get on the leg press that you're going to be using, it's probably a couple months before you really, really know what it feels like to push to failure. And especially if we're changing exercises all the time, going to different powerlifting gyms, you never get in the rhythm with just like 1 or 2 weeks of block at RP9, RP10. And so while, entire hypertrophy blocks off SBD are not a good idea in our opinion, maybe having portions of the year where we're like, okay, we're not going to go crazy on SBD for like 6 months. Let's see how good we can get at pushing our accessories. And then say the second 6 months of the year you compete and whatever. But I do think that powerlifters, as you said, they're not very good at pushing hard, just based on I think it's the gym culture. We do SPD for an hour. We're super tired. We've got to rush home, so we quickly do accessories in 30 minutes. And there's Sour Patch Kids and everyone's talking and like that's a limiting factor for sure for a
Yeah.
lot of people. And it's not how we like to train.
Yeah. I think it's funny. So you'll hear a lot of powerlifters say that they bill all their size from SBD, and 9 times out of 10, the lifters that are saying that are so genetically gifted that it really doesn't make a significant difference, what they do. And I think when you really dissect that argument, like ask yourself, as a powerlifter, like how many hard sets to failure above 4 reps or close to failure above 4 reps are you doing throughout the week in your powerlifting movements? The answer is probably zero, at least for the first 2 weeks of your block. And so the powerlifting movements are not getting you bigger after a point, right? Because when you're untrained, you don't have to train super close to failure to see growth because you don't have to tap into those higher threshold motor units. But yeah, I think that just having that conversation with the lifter and being like, hey, you need to have some sort of accessory work because you're not Ashton. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Again, genetics can make up for that. Again, like that lack of attention to detail with your programming. But it is interesting how with powerlifting, its strength is just so much more different. Like Lyle McDonald and I are actually call we talk pretty regularly, and like I was asking him about like his opinion on these more submaximal SPD approach, and like in his mind, he doesn't really see like that much of a point of it because he's like, I would just rather someone do like two hard sets and just one on hypertrophy work and whatnot, especially if they're really efficient at the movement. But I do think there's a decent component of like skill practice that people do need, even at lower intensities, that can be very very helpful. Especially as someone gets more advanced and stronger. I think even more so maximal work just because the weight on the bar is so high, it does contribute to strength at some level as far as tonnage, but it's not doing a lot for you. I think as far as like long-term potential and strength, as we know that like outside of improving technique and your muscular efficiency, the really only variable that we have long-term to control is our muscle size. But what's your guys' approach as far as I know? I definitely watched your video where you talked about how you approach like your concept of powerlifting programming, where it's like what's the minimal amount of SPD we need to feel efficient and our technique is good and we're strong at heavier weights, and then you plug on, hypertrophy movements as needed. Um, my question with that is, do you think that more powerlifters would benefit more from training, say, RPE 7 most of the block or something that's like really high intensity, and they prioritized more of that on their SPD throughout the week and did less back down work, especially if they're more advanced? Or do you think that there are some independent drivers of like those high force production reps that are driving strength at some special level that we can't really get from hypertrophy work?
Mm. I think that it's too general to make a blanket statement, but I think that if we look at things through a certain lens, so if we understand the science, we can go, okay, we know how to grow muscle. What are the sort of coordination slash neurological improvements that we make, right? So that, as you mentioned, getting in that RP7 technique work, practicing those programs and, making sure you don't like forget how to bench is like something that we'll hear. Um, I guess it just depends on how hard we think we have to train to maintain those motor programs, right? Because I don't actually, this is not my specialty. I don't know for sure what the data says about how hard you actually need to train to get coordination improvements. Obviously, it is relevant to the intensity, right? We can't say that if you can squat, 200 kilos that 100 kilo squat is going to improve your motor program. You'll always revert back to what is strongest when you get to a higher percentage, which is why we have people practicing a certain technique up to like 3 plates, and then they get to 4 plates, 5 plates, and it starts to change and look really bad. I think that for a lot of my lifters, and I'd like to hear what Alan has to say as well. A lot of my lifters, I'm just looking at, yeah, what's the least amount of work we can do to make sure that SBD is going up block to block, and then we just throw some hypertrophy in. And it's not that simple, but like, if we're looking at the long-term sustainability of an athlete, I have a lifter coming on 3 or 4 years with me now, and he wants to go to IPF Worlds in the next 2 years. And we could definitely speed up his SBD if I put more sets in, but I'm not willing to because he has such a huge capacity to grow muscle. He's extremely gifted, as Alan's, alluded to before, and he gets injured really easily despite me having a rehab background. Is very susceptible to injury, and I really can't figure out why. And so even if I do think I could speed up his SBD with more sets, but I'm not willing to do so because I don't think in the long run it's actually worth it. And I think that over specializing, those really high volume SBD programs with, heaps of sets close to failure, not only do I not think it's necessary for the motor programs, I just don't think it's super sustainable. And the injury rate in powerlifting is, I mean, I guess the quitting rate is really what we should be talking about. It's pretty high, and I think that it does, have to do with that over specialization. And my bias working with injured powerlifters is people also quit because of injuries, but that is my bias. But I think that as Alan said, we've got to sit down and be like, okay, what can we do in 5 years from now? What can we do in 2 years from now, trying to get to IPF Worlds, you know, um, and are we going to be able to do that if I put these sets up now? And I just, in that instant, that with that client, I don't think it's worth it. And as a general blanket statement, I think that most powerlifters do too much SBD and not enough accessories. But that is obviously a generalization.
Here's how I'm going to answer this. So I think your original question, should powerlifters be doing significantly lower volume like RP7 or above? In my opinion, absolutely not. I think if you give any seasoned powerlifter a program where they do that, they will not be successful. And I think that the reason why really comes down to understanding what happens as you become more advanced. Well, two big things. One is that the magnitude of improvement you make in everything diminishes. So the neurological coordination gains you make diminish. The muscular gains you make diminish in any given time period. And so you're growing muscle at a significantly slower pace. And so it doesn't make sense to prioritize muscle growth more because it's going to happen slower inevitably. From a neurological perspective, I think you can make the argument that you should specialize in the power lifts more because, as I said, like your muscle growth is going to slow so significantly that you almost have to rely on those neurological gains. Like imagine if every elite powerlifter only progressed because they grew muscle, it'd be horrendously slow. And that's not what practically happens. And there's a reason why modern powerlifting programs are not high intensity and low volume for their main lifts. And so I think you almost have to like, since we don't have direct data on this, you have to look at like, okay, what are the popular powerlifting coaches doing? There's probably a reason for it. And so while I agree with Declan that like powerlifters should push their accessories more, if you try to make a powerlifting program into a bodybuilding program, it will not be successful.
Mm. Yeah, I guess
I
you got to
fully
draw the
agree.
line between what you think is enough for SBD and what you think is enough for hypertrophy, and then just move that line as the lifter progresses. So it might be, a 50, sort of like a 50-50 split. We do some SBD, we go, do accessories. And it's quite relaxed. And then as the lifter progresses, maybe you are, as Alan said, accepting that muscle growth is going to be slower and then, pushing the envelope a little bit further. And I agree with that. I just think that most people are not there. I think most people think they're there. Most people think they're at the stage where they have to prioritize the neural gains, and they're just not.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think that what you said about if you can't make a powerlifting program, a bodybuilding program is really important. I think that if you look at a lot of these programs are powerbuilding or whatnot, like it just looks like a clusterfuck of like how many exercises can I possibly do for this muscle group, and then how many I'm going to do the SBD volume that I should be able to also do like if I'm fully recovered. And I think and if I look at lots of injury rates in powerlifting, like I think that's a big reason why. I think that people burn out because they just feel like shit. They're not making progress. Like that's like why have been, starting to get like burned out in my career is I feel like crap and I'm not getting stronger. And I just realize I have to be more specialized and really prioritize on the actual goal at hand. It's like, do I want to grow more, as much muscle as possible, live like a bodybuilder, or do I want to maximize my strength gains for the next 12 weeks? And just as a practical application, definitely with like I talked about the 4 to 8 sets. Well, I will do with a lot of my athletes, like across a macro cycle, say it's like three blocks. I'll start off with I'll accept a little bit higher levels of like fatigue, and I might be closer to 8 sets as you get closer to the meet because like I just you don't need a lot of volume to maintain hypertrophy adaptations, and I think that in the lower fatigue environment, strength tends to peak better. Like I will taper down the volume like slowly over time, so like maybe 8 sets, then to six, then to four, and I find that with a rising intensity too is an absolute load on the bar. I find for most powerlifters, like at least for myself and more long range motion people, when the intensity on the bar rises, they tend to feel worse and they get more and more of that fatigue and especially connective tissues and tendons and ligaments and whatnot. Those have much slower recovery time forces. I find that that's the only way that I can survive like that. If my goal of my next block is to you know have a decent total.
I think anecdotally you'll find a lot of taller people just fatigue easier. And I don't I mean the physiology is not different, right? Unless their physiology is, slightly different and they actually do fatigue. They have say more um higher voluntary activation or whatever, they will fatigue faster. But outside of those small physiological differences, I don't actually know why. But especially powerlifters, I mean, it's just more range of motion traveled, right? There's just more distance traveled, more work done. But yeah, I think that if, as a generalization, you can with taller lifters pull it down a bit. But yeah.
Yeah, nothing to add. I think that was sufficient.
Something I want to ask, like anecdotally, Alan, is like you are really really strong. Like I know Leslie like made a video on you like for the when he was coaching you in the past. I want to ask you like what have you found like really helped you get to that high level um in powerlifting? Like what did your training look like? Like was there a lot of accessory work or were you mostly just doing like squat bench and deadlift?
I think I got strong in spite of my training, not because of it, to be quite frank. I think looking back at my powerlifting journey, a majority of it was me doing way too much. Which is, obviously hindsight is 2020. In the moment, you want to maximize your potential, but um, I mean, it was a generic powerlifting program that you see from, most high level coaches. It's a focus on SBD. I think I sandbagged my accessories just like everyone else. I just think I started lifting at a very young age, and I think that is a factor in terms of your overall potential. And I think that made a difference in terms of my muscle mass as well.
Yeah, I just was curious because like I think that sometimes like when you mentioned I sandbag my accessories, I wonder if like that's just a function of like the programming that lifters do that is like the ceiling I can like survive what's on the sheet of paper. I don't want to let my coach down, so like telling him I feel beat up and I can't do this.
Mm.
Yeah, and it definitely was not any coach's fault. Um, like it was 100% me being an idiot and not listening to when my coach was saying, "Okay, pull back here, don't load as much here," which is funny because you tell your lifters the exact same thing, but when it's you in the hot seat, it's a big challenge.
So I guess on the topic of fatigue then, and we know that fatigue is going to be a part of training. What are some things that you guys look at as far as knowing that we're at a good amount of fatigue that, is just part of training progression? And like, what are some signs that you think it's starting to become problematic? I know that response periodization due to soreness. I know that there's a lot of research that says has nothing to do with the muscle. But I think that can have some central like fatigue mechanisms. But how do you guys basically view the relationship between fatigue and progress? Because like in my opinion, like even if a lifter has like high levels of fatigue, like really high, but they're still making progress. My question is, how much better could it be if they didn't feel that level of fatigue?
Mm. I like the question that you added at the end there because I'm not sure if you probably are familiar with Thomas Lilly, coach of Colton and
Yeah,
Theo and
totally.
those guys.
Yeah.
I'm good friends with him and that's one of the questions he gets asked sometimes with his clients. It's like oh, but that lift is already so strong, and he always says, oh, imagine how much stronger they'd be with me. And I think that's and I think we can sort of apply the same logic sometimes with the fatigue stuff. It's like, yes, it's not that it has been overhyped. It has. And that's why I've sort of recently been like, okay, look, like it's cool to understand like these fatigue mechanisms, but let's not pretend that like a set of four and a set of eight are going to be vastly different. That's getting ridiculous. In terms of signs of fatigue, I mean, look, if you look at a block and it's progressed based on what you'd expect, we don't have a problem, right? It's when we have like random things like I have a client who I look at the volume, it looks great. The sessions are spaced apart really well. There's no, the recovery's there. He tracks everything in his metric sheet down to the quality of the sleep, digestion, everything. I'm looking at all these things, program. He does it on the exact same days each week. Nutrition's great. He has like never ticks stressed in his boxes. Everything is perfect. And I'm going, why are we still sore off 5 sets of pecs a week? Why won't the incline press progress, right? And so in that instance, I'm going, okay, maybe now my understanding of fatigue mechanisms comes into play. Okay, let's stretch a little bit less on the pec deck, see if that helps. It does. Great. And then let's not go quite as low on that incline press. We probably don't need to go that low. We probably don't need as much stretch, and it picks up again. Okay, awesome. And then there might be some sort of swap with, whether we do the heaviest set first or second based on their psychology. And that's not really fatigue, but motivation certainly, comes into play here as well. And that helps as well. And then over time, the soreness goes away and the progression picks up. And so it's in those instances where your knowledge of fatigue comes really handy. I had the same thing with a different client. Dips weren't progressing. Let's just reduce that range of motion a tiny bit, and then the progression picks up again. Not because we're doing less range and it's easier, but because there was less muscle damage. And that's where it becomes important. When we're looking at like, yeah, again, maybe we don't train 6 days a week. Maybe we shouldn't do that. If you're training like 3 to 5 days a week, especially if you're training 3 to 4 days a week and you're not doing more than 10 sets, you're good. Like, I don't think you need to know or understand anything more than that. 3 to 4 days a week, less than 10 sets, you're good. It becomes when progress slows down for those intermediate advanced lifters where you're like, okay, I know the four fatigue mechanisms. Another good example would be like someone who takes a long time to do their setup on a T-bar and they're pausing between reps and they're hesitating. That's its own sort of little fatigue mechanism. And then you go, okay, let's cut that out. Spinal fatigue goes down, it increases again. That stuff's important, for those advanced lifters when you're really troubleshooting. And we watch all the training videos. So you're always sort of on top of technique. We know what the issues are really quickly. For most people, like, I mean, we've referenced like TikTok here a couple of times. That stuff is not like I've seen the worst tricep push downs I've ever seen in the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 reps. The shoulders coming up here like this, the fucking cables going everywhere, just dog shit,
Their
terrible.
buddies holding them down.
One of them actually commented on my page and corrected me, and this is not someone who's known. It was just a random kid, and I looked on his page, and it was just the worst push downs I'd ever seen. And hey, he was training hard, right? And I encouraged that, and I did the same thing when I was like 19. But like, if our push downs we're below 5 reps for the sake of fatigue and it looks like garbage, maybe we should put it up a little bit. Maybe we shouldn't worry so much. That's I mean, we could go on about it fatigue forever, but yeah.
Yeah. Firstly, not to bash RP because Dr. Mike makes way more money than I do, but
For
um,
now,
for now, soreness is a horrible proxy for fatigue because fatigue is defined as like an objective transient reduction in performance, and not all fatigue you can feel. Most of it you can. Soreness is really I don't even think we have a good mechanism for soreness or understanding of it, but it's really just when you do something new. And Adam, I'm sure there are plenty of times where you have felt fine, but you're just weak. And that's a great example of fatigue. But I think to quickly answer the question, there's two ways to look at it. One is the practical way, which is, are you progressing? If you're progressing, then don't worry about it. Because, and I have people ask me all the time, like, are these movements redundant or something along those lines? And I'm like, are both of them progressing? If they are, then does it matter? No. I think the more complicated way is understanding that okay, the more sets you do, the longer it takes to recover. So 3 sets you can recover from in about 48 hours, 5 sets, 72 hours. And so if you're a coach, you should have that understanding because that should be built into your program um, to have things make sense. Like you shouldn't be doing 8 sets of hamstrings in one day because that's going to take you a whole week to recover from. And if you have hamstrings again in 3 days, now you're accumulating fatigue debt, which is a real like tangible concept. But I think practically, like what you should be preaching to your lifters is if they're progressing, you're okay.
Yep. This last week, I was like, I told like Joe, I was like, I feel so bad, but I still PR'd everything. And I think sometimes, like, the reason I was asking that is because, like, I think that sometimes as you get more advanced, like, you have to accept those high levels of the fatigue. That's also why, I think the fatigue management periods become even more appropriate because you are going to have to push that much closer to like what your limit is. And because you're just that much closer to your genetic limit. If you look at like guys like Ben Pollock, for example, like wicked strong guy, and like he just doesn't do a lot of volume, but he also biases a little more towards higher frequencies. And I know that I had Berge Fagerly on this. He was saying that like he would rather have someone do like 1 or 2 sets like per day in general. It's like more frequent like stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, and also he's Norwegian, so the Norwegian Frequency Project. So, but I really like what you said, Alan, about understanding like the actual recovery time course. because a lot of times if you look at that, it's like there's like, of course I feel like crap. It's still, I'm not recovered yet. Like I'm in um that recovery stage all the time. Now if someone is constantly feeling like crap and you get them feeling better and I start making progress again, like I generally tell my athletes, I'm like, look, as the block goes on, you're going to notice your fatigue. Like regardless of what we do, if you're getting stronger, for performance systems improving, you're going to inevitably become at a point where fatigue faces your fitness. And that is well, that is just part of the process. All that matters is that we get in front of that and that we're not, we catch that so we're functionally overreached. And like I think the thing about deloading too is like you can actually make really good gains in that week. In fact, I actually frame it as like the more strong that you are, that's the only way you actually benefit from those higher absolute loads. That's just been my experience. If I don't deload like pretty hard after a really heavy week of training, my next block sucks and I just maladapt. I'll be like just be weaker.
Mm. I think that, I mean, deloads are undoubtedly an important part of any good powerlifting program, right? The frequency, would be how the coach decides he wanted to do it and what's he think, what happens with the lifter. Um, if though we can use it as a bit of a test, if we see a significant improvement in accessory work the week after, or it will only be the week after. If we see a significant improvement to a point that it's like suspicious, that might be a good sign that maybe the accessories were a little high in the last block, right? Like I say the same thing with peaking as well. Is like your peaks should be predictable. Like I mean, they go really well sometimes and poorly other times, but there should be some predictability about them, right? If they go ridiculously well, and like in the last week or two of training, you've pulled back all accessories or reduced the volume or reduced the intensity, or there's, I tend to leave some accessories in to just, um, you know, stay mobile basically. But if there's a ridiculous improvement in performance in that space before the comp, that and then like a huge jump up in strength on comp day, yeah, you've written the peak well, it's gone well, but there should be some level of suspicion. It's like, okay, why did my accessories feel easier and better in the last 2 weeks of a prep? Like that shouldn't really be happening. Realistically, it shouldn't. You're
Hmm.
not getting that much stronger in 6 weeks. Um, and your SPD fatigue's at an all-time high. If you're also pulling back accessories and then seeing the progress on them pick up, you're almost definitely doing too much volume because it shouldn't happen that late. You're maxing out or getting close to it, whatever. All the CNS fatigue is there. It's then you're looking at, okay, maybe we were doing too much. And I think like, yes, it happens. Good peaks will have a lift to get stronger, but same with deloads, but to a certain degree, beyond a certain point, it becomes almost suspicious where I go, okay, maybe we did too much because it shouldn't be this good. It shouldn't be this much better. It shouldn't be this different. It should be probably a little bit more predictable than what we're experiencing right now. I'd love to hear what Alan thinks about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think in the last, I'd say 4 years, in large part due to people like Steve, Marcellus, Joe, modern powerlifting programming has, at least in the US, has shifted away from this whole peak and taper strategy. Like if you have a conversation with anything, which I'm sure you have, it's more so like how can we replicate your best week four on meet day? And I know Steve has talked about that specifically. That's the approach he generally uses for his clients, and I mean, I think it's a great approach because what I think what should matter more to you as a coach is knowing with a high degree of certainty that your athlete is going to perform within these parameters, as opposed to like having it be a complete toss up. They either feel really good or really bad. And I think kind of working backwards from there, powerlifting programming has become a lot more about consistency. And a lot of these coaches preach like keeping their blocks the same. They make very small changes, which I think is great. And I think that really underscores like, okay, find the amount of volume that you need to potentiate progression, volume and intensity, and just keep it relatively similar. That's why we don't see more any more of like the hypertrophy strength and power blocks because I think there's just too much variation there.
And that speaks to
Right.
the whole fatigue thing as well. Like powerlifting coaches will, as Alan said, we're sort of shifting away, but like, the peak has to be perfect. We have to have the perfect days for bench. We have to have the perfect amount of this and that. It's like, oh, so we do care about fatigue. we do when it comes to writing the end of the block for competition. But then the rest of the year, it's just like, oh, that doesn't matter. It's like, well,
Yeah.
you got to pick, and you can't have it both ways. Either it does or it doesn't matter. And yeah, I think the making it the comp week just like a normal week 4 with some less accessories and whatever you need. I mean, that's a great way to do it. It's super predictable, and it's like, if we have to train a certain way all year and then 3 weeks out from comp just completely disregard the way we've been training, not only do you change all the variables, become super unpredictable, but again, it should just indicate that what you were doing is too much or something's going wrong because it shouldn't have to change that much.
Yeah, it depends on a lifter though. Like for like Jesus is pulling back on the week 4, brother. He's pulling
Yeah.
Yeah,
back.
well,
So
I don't. If yeah, I mean, there's going to
yeah,
be outliers. Uh, yeah, but that's a good point. Yes, it
yeah,
depends on the person, obviously. Body weight pending actually matters a lot too. But
yeah.
yeah,
Sure. I think that one thing there, how I always frame things to my lifters, like sometimes when I get a client that comes to me to explain, they kind of they're complaining of high levels of fatigue. I immediately pull them back, get them feeling better, and they usually like can't see more progress from that. They're overreach. Fatigue is a a limiter there, and then I always look at more long-term sustainable progress. That's like an actual spot where they need to that's actually a appropriate amount of volume for them. But I think that like if you're having like that acute massive increase in performance, like it's something was definitely off with your programming. You probably could have made more progress the entire block leading up to the competition instead of having to rely on dissipating down fatigue to then express your strength. I think the main reason why we see deadlifts peak more is just because there's generally less of the axial loading of the squat on the week of the meet. Um, then I think like as far as like increasing volumes, that can be something that some people do need. You have to look at how sustainable is that from a performance perspective, and then injury. I think that injury is one of the best indicators that it's not always programming related, but say if you have like a pretty consistent life and you're not like overly physically active outside of training, um, if you are getting recurring injuries in a certain area, you are doing too much. Like full stop, and you need to hold things back. Like for myself, I don't do a lot of squat intensity. I do 2 heavier sets a week. I spread out, and then I do like 1 or 2 back down sets per day, or as 1 or 2 warm up ascending sets to my top set. Then I push accessories, and I do 8 sets a week of that, and that's how I'm able to make progress without overly fatiguing my lower back and my SI joint.
Declan, you want to
So
go first?
no, I was actually thought this one was perfect for you,
Yeah.
man.
I could talk about this for forever, but I agree with you. I think that like this is my take, but is backed by evidence. But I think a majority of rehab for powerlifters has to come from the gym, like from your training, load management, like range of motion reduction, and dude, the PR. I'm not going to get into the whole PRI thing, but um,
No, please go
the
for it.
only thing I'll say is if you look on their website, they have like 3 randomized control trials in support of anything PRI related. But to your point, like in order to truly, in my opinion, like understand injury, you have in powerlifting, you have to like understand powerlifting itself. It's not just about understanding where you're weak, because if you're training, if you're doing too much in your training, and then you go to a PT and they give you a couple exercises to add on to your training, now you're just doing more. How are you going to get better from doing more? That doesn't make any sense. So, I think you made a great point. Like your rehab for powerlifters comes from programming adjustment. For the most part, there are exceptions. If you're glaringly weak or glaringly lacking range of motion somewhere, you should address that. But um, yeah, that's my 2 minute uh,
Hmm.
take on that.
I fully
I
agree.
was gonna I was you go.
Sorry, I fully agree because the biggest thing I've seen is it's hilarious. People are like, "Your back hurts. Let's do more hinging. Let's do more low back extensions." I'm like, "Bro, you're overly compressed. Like, how stupid are you?" It's like, Declan, I come from a rehab background too, and like, it's like they are hurt because their tissue tolerance has exceeded. It's a very basic fundamental like physiological principle, and you have to pull back in some way, shape, or form. And guess what? As people get stronger too. maybe they can't tolerate as much fun. Maybe that's why their intensity needs to go down on their downsets because their tendons can't handle the absolute
Mhm.
load. And like it's still stimulative of that top end strength. So go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just quickly as to the handling more, like the motor unit recruitment gains we make as we get stronger and more experienced quite literally mean that you can not only get more from less work, but you also get more fatigue. So, like for example, a beginner does 4 sets and gets the same amount of stimulus that I might get in a set or a set and a half. Obviously,
Yep.
that's arbitrary, but you know what I mean. Because my motor unit recruitment, my voluntary activation is way higher. I can activate, way higher, close to 100% or closer than a beginner. So yes, you literally just can't do as much, but you don't need to, and it's a good thing. Why would you want to do 4 sets if you could do two? Like, I love training as much as the next guy, but like if I've done 4 sets of a muscle group in a session, once I've done two leg extensions, 2 sets of squats, I don't need to do more quads. I've had my fun. And that's obviously that's preference. But yeah, anecdotally, I was gonna say my physio and one of my mentors, he rehabs, he's rehab. I've sat in on with Colton in the lead up to his 500, his world record total. I sat in on that rehab session, and it is very much a case of okay, like let's have a little bit of a look at some tabletop stuff, but like let's look at the program and let's work with Thomas in this case and adjust what we need to adjust. Maybe we'll sneak in some little things that might help us like move slightly better, but as Alan said, the majority of it comes with like let's just pull back a touch. And Thomas is very conservative, so for us to need to pull back, with those people, you're looking at like someone like Theo who deadlifts like once a fortnight, which I didn't know you guys didn't say in America, which is every 2 weeks. And so it's like when you have someone who's deadlifting every second week, how do you pull back? What do you do? Maybe at that point, maybe then there's some little drills that, maybe we put in the here and there. But like, yeah, I mean, throwing your lifters some side-lying breathing stuff and a foam roller goblet squat, it's like, brother, like, if you're actually strong, what change are you making? Like the only
Yeah.
reason, I mean, this is a generalization, but like if a drill helps you move in a better way, like let's say for example, I've seen like multiple powerlifters present with the same hip pain. One leg sucks in terms of mobility. They shift off it onto the other leg. So like let's say we are lacking like left hip internal rotation. They squat down, they try to access it, they can't, so they shift off onto their right leg. They load up that right, say knee a shitload more. And so like instead of just stopping squatting, if we could try to improve that internal rotation on that left side with a drill, sure. And then you could literally, I've literally seen them go from before and after, and we have better internal rotation, and they're not loading up that right leg as more. It doesn't hurt as much. In that instance, yeah, that stuff is useful. But you still have to adjust the load, and most of the time it is just adjusting, load management. Sometimes there is, in my opinion, there's a place for these things, but it's never as often as you see. Like we don't need to do the heel supported single leg B stance RDL breathing thing. Just like maybe don't train as hard for a week or two and see what happens.
Yeah, and Declan, to your point, so this is the last thing I'll say about this because I don't want to go on a tangent, but like a lot of these drills, whether they have a biomechanical effect is debated, right? Like especially the PRI stuff. Is it really improving something biomechanically? Maybe, maybe not. What it likely is doing is diminishing your pain in the short term. And that's why you see a lot of these people doing these drills like prior to squat, prior to deadlift. But here's the thing, pain, pain is like demonized, but like because of like the whole biopsychosocial model and whatever. But pain for powerlifters, I will argue, is telling you that there is likely tissue damage. Like there, like either your tendon is unhappy, and so you have to ask yourself, like, do I want to diminish my pain? Because the pain is literally telling you that you have something damaged there, likely. And so if you're diminished, spending 30 minutes to diminish that pain, and then you go into a squat session, now like your nervous system is not telling you whether like that tissue damage is getting worse or not. And so, like, trying to constantly reduce pain as a powerlifter is, in my opinion, different than you have someone come off the street who has never touched a weight in their entire life. You know, their BMI is 60 and they're in chronic pain, and that pain isn't necessarily related to tissue damage. Like for powerlifters, like brother, your pec tendon hurts because you're benching 4 days a week, not because you have a psychological aspect to your pain.
Yeah, I mean, I want
I
to go on the
actually would
record
fully
as
agree.
I was
Yeah.
not defending PRI. To Alan's point, I was not defending any of that shit. But yeah, go on, Adam.
No, I fully agree because if you think about it, it's like powerlifters. I'm like, bro, I deadlift 300, 17 and a half kilos. Like, I'm not weak there. Like, or like if I hurt myself, like usually it happens with like heavier weights or like right after you hit heavier weights, like you're like, oh, my lat went. It's like, yeah, there's probably some damage there that's like you just took longer to heal from, and then usually it's like those connective tissue rates and the other soft tissues and nervous system. But fully agree with you there, Alan. I think that it's something that you need to just really be like, okay, like I've been hurt, and this is something I need to like make sure I'm not trying to minimize because like I think that's actually why people get hurt on drugs a lot. Is because like more recruitment number one higher, so more damage to the overall muscles, to the tendons, to the ligaments. You can push past those things where like if you were natural, maybe you would have had that performance reduction a week ago, but you're enhanced. You can keep going, and then you're even more fucked up. And that's why you see these enhanced guys like care have so much more catastrophic injuries than naturals, in my opinion.
Right. Yeah. Agreed.
So cool. I gotta get going. So I want to thank you guys so much for coming on the show. Really awesome to talking with you guys. I wanted to give you guys the chance to plug your services, since you guys really know what you're talking about, and I've gotten some people some really awesome results.
Thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
I mean, if you thank you first of all, thanks so much for having us on. And I know Alan, it's getting close to bedtime for you, so I appreciate you coming on as well. If you want to work with either of us, you can go to Hypertrophy Academy. Alan handles all of our powerlifters, all of our new powerlifters at least. Um, but yeah, you can work with either of us through our Instagrams, or an easier way would be just go straight through the Hypertrophy Academy Instagram page, go in the bio. We've got a couple spots open, and you can pick and choose who you want to work with, powerlifters or go on Allen. Otherwise, we've got programs that you can get, and the academy education as well for coaches who want to learn a whole system. But no, I really appreciate you having us on and giving us the time and the space.
Yeah. Thank you.
I was gonna say Chick-fil-A, my pleasure. So I don't know if you even know where that is. You
He
kangaroo
doesn't.
man,
I've
kangaroo
heard of
man.
Chick-fil-A. I've been to Warrington.
Yeah,
I've been.
well, okay. It's got that street cred. Anyways, talk to you guys in the next one.